She painted her ships black and her sails the color of blood. For 13 years, this grieving widow didn't just pirate ships, she hunted them. She personally beheaded every captured nobleman with an axe, sparing only one witness to carry a horrific message to the king: the lioness is coming for you. The gray, suffocating mist of an early morning in the year 1343, the city of Nantes awoke to a sight that defied the sanctity of death and the honor of knighthood. High above the heavy timber of the Sauvetout gate, a gruesome trophy swayed slightly in the damp breeze, a visceral warning that turned the stomachs of even the most hardened city guards. Impaled upon the iron point of a pike was the severed head of Olivier de Clisson, a man who had been, only days prior, one of the most illustrious and powerful lords of Brittany. His dead eyes, now clouding with the milky film of decay, were fixed in a permanent, hollow stare toward the lands he once ruled, while the jagged ruin of his neck dripped dark, coagulated blood onto the ancient stonework below, staining the city's entrance with the physical mark of a king's tyranny. The display was an abomination that shattered the unwritten laws of medieval warfare and aristocratic privilege, sending a tremor of genuine fear through the gathered commoners. In this era, the execution of a nobleman was typically a solemn, private affair, or at least one accorded the dignity of a clean death and a proper burial, yet King Philip VI had chosen to treat a high-born knight like a common thief or a peasant murderer. The head on the pike was not merely the remains of a man, it was a deliberate political statement, a desecration intended to terrify the rebellious Breton nobility into submission. The silence that hung over the crowd was heavy with unspoken horror, as fishmongers and merchants paused in their morning labors, crossing themselves rapidly and muttering prayers to ward off the evil eye that surely watched from Paris. The assembled throng lingered by the gates not merely out of morbid curiosity, but because they awaited the arrival of the victim's family, anticipating a scene of heartbreaking tragedy. They expected to see a shattered widow, a woman broken by the sudden and brutal loss of her husband, dragging herself through the mud to beg the garrison commanders for the mercy of retrieving the remains. The narrative in their minds was one of weeping and collapse, of a fragile noblewoman fainting at the sight of her beloved's mutilation. They prepared themselves to witness the end of the House of Clisson, assuming that the king's ruthless stroke would scatter the family into obscure poverty and frightened exile, forever silencing their claims to power in the turbulent region of Brittany. However, when the small procession finally emerged from the shroud of fog, the reality struck the onlookers with the force of a physical blow, silencing their murmurs instantly. Jeanne de Clisson did not crawl, nor did she weep. She rode toward the gate with a spine as rigid as the pike that held her husband, her face a mask of terrifying, unnatural calm. Flanked by her two young sons, Olivier and Guillaume, she approached the site of the atrocity not as a beggar, but as a judge arriving to pass sentence. Her eyes, dry and burning with a cold intelligence, swept over the crowd before locking onto the horrific silhouette above the gate, refusing to flinch or look away from the rot that had begun to claim the features of the men she loved. She halted her horse directly beneath the shadow of the archway, the animal shifting nervously as if it could smell the death in the air, but Jeanne's hands on the reins were steady and unyielding. With a slow, deliberate movement that commanded the attention of every soul in the plaza, she gestured for her children to look up, denying them the comfort of averting their gaze. The boys, terrified and trembling in the morning chill, were forced to confront the nightmare head-on, their innocent eyes widening as they processed the grotesque reality of their father's murder. It was a moment of supreme cruelty, yet it was born of a desperate necessity. Jeanne was stripping away their childhood in real time, cauterizing their grief with the searing heat of trauma. The silence of the mother was louder than any scream, as she compelled her sons to memorize every detail of the injustice, etching the image of the severed head into their minds forever. She needed them to see that the code of chivalry was a lie and that the King of France was not a divinely appointed protector, but a butcher who had betrayed their blood. The betrayal was fresh and stinging. Olivier had been lured to Paris under the guise of a celebration, a tournament meant to honor a truce, only to be seized, chained, and executed without a trial. By forcing her sons to witness the result of this treachery, Jeanne was ensuring that the seed of hatred would take deep root in their hearts, growing into a vine that would eventually strangle the monarchy that had orphaned them. As the minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity, the onlookers realized they were witnessing a transformation far more frightening than the execution itself. The woman who sat atop her horse was shedding the skin of a courtly lady, discarding the expectations of her gender and station with every breath she took in the presence of the corpse. The grief that should have poured out in tears was instead crystallizing into something hard and sharp within her chest, a diamond of pure malice that would fuel her for the rest of her days. She was no longer simply Jean de Belleville or the Lady of Clisson. In the shadow of that gate, under the gaze of her husband's dead eyes, she was becoming the entity that history would come to fear, an avenging fury forged in the fires of French betrayal. The psychological weight of the scene pressed down upon the young boys, who ceased their quiet whimpering as they absorbed the steely resolve radiating from their mother. They looked from the gruesome trophy above to the stone face of the woman beside them, understanding without a single spoken word that their lives had been irrevocably altered. The innocence of their youth died that morning, left on the cobblestones of Nantes, replaced by a dark inheritance of obligation and blood. Jean was not protecting them from the world's horrors, she was arming them with the knowledge that the world was a slaughterhouse, and that to survive, one must become the blade rather than the lamb. Finally, with a last, lingering look at the face of Olivier, Jean turned her horse away from the city, her back straight and her resolve absolute. She did not ask for the head to be taken down, nor did she speak to the guards who watched her with a mixture of awe and unease from the battlements. To take the body now would be to accept the defeat, to play the role of the burying wife, leaving it there transformed it into a monument to the king's crime, a constant reminder of the debt that was owed. As she rode away into the thinning mist, the silence she left behind was heavy with the promise of violence, the atmosphere charged with the static of a storm that would soon break over the seas of France. The people of Nantes watched her depart until she was nothing more than a dark shape on the horizon, feeling a collective shiver that had nothing to do with the damp morning air. They had expected a tragedy, but they had witnessed the prologue of a war, written not in ink but in the silence of a widow who refused to break. The head of Olivier de Clisson continued to rot above the gate, a grisly sentinel, but the true horror had just ridden away, carrying with it a plan for vengeance so vast and so bloody that it would turn the waters of the English Channel red. The King of France believed he had ended a rebellion with the swing of an executioner's axe, but in truth, he had merely unleashed a nightmare that would hunt his ships and his lords for 13 long years. The genesis of this dark odyssey lay not in the heat of battle, but in a calculated act of treachery that fundamentally shattered the moral foundations of the European knighthood. It began in the summer of the year 1343, a time when the fragile truce of Malestroit was supposed to have brought a temporary peace to the blood-soaked lands of Brittany. However, for King Philip VI of France, peace was merely a veil behind which he could orchestrate the destruction of those he deemed too powerful or too independent to control. The king watched with mounting paranoia as the Breton lords, proud and fiercely autonomous, navigated the dangerous waters between the French crown and the English invaders, and in his mind, their neutrality was nothing short of treason that required a permanent and violent solution. Driven by this consuming suspicion and the fear that his authority was waning in the West, Philip conceived a plan that would violate the sacred laws of hospitality which had governed noble society for centuries. He issued a royal summons, inviting the most prominent aristocrats of Brittany to Paris for a grand tournament, a celebration of chivalry that promised feasting, jousting, and the strengthening of bonds between the sovereign and his vassals. Among the invitees was Olivier de Clisson, a man of immense stature and reputation, who rode to the capital believing in the honor of his king. He traveled with a retinue befitting his station, unsuspecting that the garlands of welcome prepared for him were woven with the invisible threads of a hangman's noose. The atmosphere in Paris upon their arrival was electric with the pageantry of the court, a facade of opulence designed to lull the victims into a false sense of security. The city was adorned with banners, and the streets hummed with the anticipation of the games, masking the grim reality that the dungeons of the Châtelet were already being prepared for guests of a very different nature. Olivier de Clisson and his peers were received with smiles and open arms, toasted at banquets where the wine flowed freely, yet all the while, the king's agents were finalizing the lists of the proscribed. It was a masterclass in deception, a theater of statecraft where the actors were unaware that the final act would not be a joust, but a massacre. The trap was sprung with a suddenness that left the Breton lords no time to reach for their swords or rally their men. In the midst of the festivities, the royal guards moved in, shedding the pretense of celebration to arrest Olivier and over a dozen of his compatriots. The shock that rippled through the gathered nobility was absolute, for to seize a guest under the banner of a truce was a sin that stained the soul of the perpetrator as surely as it doomed the victim. There were no formal charges read at the moment of capture, only the cold steel of shackles and the rough hands of soldiers dragging the flower of Breton chivalry into the damp darkness of the royal prisons. Once confined within the stone walls of the Châtelet, the pretense of justice was abandoned entirely, revealing the king's intent to be one of extermination rather than adjudication. There was to be no trial by combat, no calling of witnesses, and no opportunity for the accused to speak in their own defense, rights that were theoretically guaranteed to every nobleman in the realm. The legal scholars of the court were silenced or complicit, as Philip demanded a verdict that matched his paranoia rather than the truth. The prisoners were accused of conspiring with King Edward III of England, a charge that carried the weight of high treason, yet no letters were produced, and no confessions were recorded save those that might have been whispered under the threat of torture. The speed with which the proceedings moved was indicative of a monarch terrified that his actions might spark an immediate uprising if given time to ferment. In a matter of days, the fate of Olivier de Clisson was sealed by a royal decree that bypassed the Parliament of Paris, transforming the king into judge, jury, and executioner. The sentence was death, a punishment usually reserved for the lowest of criminals when delivered with such haste, stripping the condemned of the dignity usually afforded to the dying aristocracy. It was a purge, brutal and efficient, designed to decapitate the leadership of Brittany in a single afternoon and leave the region leaderless and pliable to French rule. On the 2nd day of August in the year 1343, the final stage of this tragedy was enacted at Les Halles, the bustling market center of Paris. The site was chosen for maximum visibility, ensuring that the death of these lords would be witnessed by the masses, spreading the message of terror far beyond the city walls. Olivier de Clisson was brought forth not in his armor, but in the simple tunic of a condemned man, stripped of the heraldry that told the story of his ancestors. The crowd, usually raucous at public executions, fell into a stunned silence, realizing that they were witnessing not the punishment of a criminal, but the murder of a hero, a man who had fought for France in years past and was now being discarded like refuse. The executioner performed his grim task with the mechanical efficiency of a slaughterhouse worker, unbothered by the rank of his victim. Olivier was not granted the mercy of a clean sword usually reserved for the nobility, but was instead subjected to the axe or the blade of the common headsman, a final insult intended to degrade his status even in death. As the blow fell, it severed more than just a head, it severed the bond of loyalty that held the feudal system together. The blood that soaked the scaffold at Les Halles signaled to every lord in France that their titles and service offered no protection against the whims of a fearful king, and that the crown had become a predator devouring its own defenders. But the horror did not end with the death of the body, it continued with the systematic desecration of the remains, a calculated act of psychological warfare. The corpse of Olivier de Clisson, along with those of his companions, was taken to the gibbet of Montfaucon, a massive structure of stone and wood located outside the city gates. There, the headless body was hung by the armpits from the great beams, left to sway in the wind alongside common thieves and murderers. This was the ultimate humiliation, denying the noble family the right to a Christian burial and leaving the vessel of a great knight to be picked apart by crows and scorched by the sun, a rotting monument to the king's wrath. The treatment of the body at Montfaucon was intended to be a spectacle for the Parisians, but the king had a specific message for the people of Brittany. The head of Olivier de Clisson was not left with the body, it was preserved, treated with salts and spices to delay the inevitable decay, and packed for a long journey westward. Philip VI ordered that this grisly trophy be transported all the way to Nantes, the capital of the Breton Duchy, to be displayed on the city's ramparts. It was a decision of grotesque cruelty, ensuring that the first thing the people of Nantes would see was the face of their fallen leader, staring blindly down at the streets he once walked. The journey of the severed head across the French countryside was a macabre procession that gathered whispers and rumors in every village it passed. Couriers and guards bore the box containing the remains like a dark relic, and word spread ahead of them that the king had gone mad with power. This act, intended to cow the Bretons into submission, instead planted the seeds of a deep and abiding hatred that would outlast the king himself. By sending the head to Nantes, Philip was not ending a rebellion, he was inviting a vengeance that would rise from the very soil of Brittany, a vengeance that would soon take the shape of a grieving widow and a black ship. When the head finally arrived in Nantes, it was mounted on a pike above the Sauvetout gate, the very spot where it would later be visited by Jean and her sons. The placement was deliberate, chosen to ensure that no traveler could enter or leave the city without passing under the judgment of the dead knight. The intention was to create an omnipresent reminder of French authority, a symbol that said, "This is the fate of traitors." However, the king had miscalculated the resilience of the Breton spirit and the depth of the fury he had ignited in the heart of Clisson's wife. He saw the head as a period at the end of a sentence, but for Jean, it was the opening capital letter of a new chapter written in blood. The betrayal was total, encompassing every facet of the social contract that bound the medieval world together. The king had lied, he had entrapped, he had murdered, and he had desecrated, systematically breaking every commandment of chivalry. In doing so, he had liberated his enemies from the constraints of honor. If the king was no longer bound by the laws of God and men, then neither were those who sought to destroy him. The poison of this realization seeped into the minds of the nobility, but nowhere did it become as potent or as lethal as in the mind of Jean de Clisson, who realized that justice would not come from a court, but from the edge of an axe. This event marked a turning point in the history of the 100 Years' War, transforming a political dispute into a personal vendetta of epic proportions. The execution of Olivier de Clisson stripped away the romantic veneer of knighthood, revealing the brutal power struggle beneath. It taught the survivors that in this new world, there was no safety in tradition, and that the only way to answer the savagery of a tyrant was with a savagery that exceeded it. As the sun set over the rotting head in Nantes, the era of polite warfare ended, and the age of the Black Fleet began, born from the ashes of a trust that had been so violently incinerated. The tremors of this execution were felt far beyond the borders of France, reaching the courts of England and the Holy Roman Empire. Monarchs and princes looked on with unease, recognizing that Philip had set a dangerous precedent that threatened the stability of the entire feudal order. If a king could slaughter his own high-born guests without consequence, then the structure of loyalty that held kingdoms together was nothing more than a sham. Yet, amidst the geopolitical shockwaves, the most dangerous reaction was the quietest one, the cold, calculating silence of a woman selling her lands, buying ships, and painting her soul the same color as the void that had been left in her life. Thus, the stage was fully set for the emergence of the Lioness of Brittany. The king had believed that by cutting off the head of the snake, the body would die, but he had failed to see that he was merely creating a hydra. The betrayal at Paris did not crush the rebellion, it distilled it into a pure, concentrated form of hatred that would take to the waves. The ghost of Olivier de Clisson, hovering over the gates of Nantes, would not rest, for his widow was about to embark on a crusade that would make the King of France wish he had never signed that invitation to the tournament. The die was cast, the blood was spilled, and the storm was gathering on the horizon, ready to crash against the shores of the Valois dynasty. In the wake of the atrocity at the Sauvetout Gate, the royal court in Paris and the surviving nobility of Brittany anticipated a specific, predictable sequence of events. The conventional script for a widow in the 14th century, particularly one whose husband had been branded a traitor, was a retreat into the shadows of a convent or a quiet exile in a remote country manor. They expected Jean de Clisson to vanish, crushed by the shame of her husband's public execution and the seizure of his assets, effectively erasing the Clisson name from the annals of power. It was assumed that fear would be the dominant emotion governing her actions, for the king had demonstrated that no lineage was ancient enough to protect against his wrath, and any further defiance would surely result in the imprisonment of her children or her own death. However, Jean de Clisson did not possess the temperament of a victim, nor did she have any intention of fading quietly into the obscurity that Philip VI had designed for her. Instead of seeking the protection of other lords, which would have required her to beg for sanctuary and likely swear fealty to men who had stood by while her husband was butchered, she chose a path of radical independence. She understood that in the feudal world, justice was a commodity that could only be purchased with power, and power was inextricably checking link to wealth and violence. Therefore, she formulated a plan that was viewed as absolute madness by her contemporaries. She would liquidate her entire existence to finance a private war against the most powerful monarch in Christendom. The process began with a systematic dismantling of her feudal legacy, a fire sale of heritage that stunned the observers of the time. Jean de Belleville, as she was known by her own noble birth, possessed vast tracts of land in her own right, territories in Poitou and Lower Brittany that had been in her family for generations. These were not merely economic assets, they were the physical manifestation of her status, her history, and her children's inheritance. With a cold, terrifying efficiency, she placed these lands on the market, offering them to the highest bidder regardless of their political allegiance. She sold manors, hunting grounds, vineyards, and forests, severing the deep connection between blood and soil that defined the aristocracy of the Middle Ages. The buyers were often shocked by the haste of the transactions, sensing the desperation of a fire sale, yet they were equally unnerved by the steely resolve of the woman signing the deeds. She did not haggle for the sake of profit but for the sake of speed, converting centuries of accumulated feudal stability into liquid capital in a matter of weeks. The furniture that had filled her castles, heavy oak tables where knights had feasted and tapestries that depicted the glories of the past, was carted away and sold to merchants. Every item that could not be carried on a ship or used to kill a Frenchman was deemed surplus to requirements, transformed into piles of silver and gold coinage that grew steadily in her strongboxes. Perhaps the most symbolic act of this self-imposed purgation was the sale of her personal jewelry and courtly finery. The diamonds, rubies, and pearls that had once adorned her neck at royal banquets were stripped away, treated not as sentimental keepsakes but as cold geological resources to be mined for the war effort. These gems, which had once signaled her inclusion in the elite circle of French nobility, were now destined to pay for the pitch, timber, and steel of a fleet designed to destroy that very circle. By selling her jewelry, Jean was physically shedding her identity as a noblewoman, rejecting the decorative role assigned to her gender in favor of the utilitarian brutality of a warlord. The sum raised by this total liquidation was colossal, a fortune that could have purchased a comfortable life in any city in Europe, yet Jean invested every sou into a singular, deadly purpose. She traveled to the coastal harbors, likely turning to English sympathizers or independent shipwrights who cared more for gold than for the wrath of the French king. With her war chest, she purchased 3 mid-sized warships, vessels that were agile, sturdy, and capable of navigating the treacherous currents of the English Channel. These were not converted merchant cogs, but ships built for aggression, sleek predators that would soon become the most feared silhouettes on the horizon. But purchasing the ships was only the first step. They needed to be manned, and Jean knew that ordinary sailors would not suffice for the campaign of terror she envisioned. She needed men who had fallen through the cracks of society, outcasts who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from a war of vengeance. She scoured the docks and the taverns, recruiting a crew of the most notorious cutthroats, mercenaries, and exiles in Brittany. These were men who had been broken by the war, men whose families had starved under French taxes, or simply violent souls who thrived on chaos. She offered them not just pay, but a share in the plunder and, more importantly, a license to unleash their worst instincts upon the king's subjects. The composition of this motley army was a direct affront to the chivalric order, for it was a force bound not by feudal oaths or religious duty, but by a shared pact of hatred and greed. Jean walked among them not as a distant lady of the manor, but as a captain, commanding their respect through the sheer force of her will and the tangible promise of blood. She outfitted them with the best weapons her fortune could buy, crossbows, boarding axes, and swords, transforming a rabble of criminals into a disciplined, lethal fighting force. They looked at the grieving widow and saw a leader more terrifying than any knight they had ever served, a woman who had burned her bridges to light the way to hell. Once the ships were acquired and the crews assembled, Jean ordered a cosmetic transformation of the fleet that would turn her personal grief into a public nightmare. She commanded that the hulls of all 3 vessels be painted entirely black, a color rarely seen on the hulls of the time, which were usually treated with natural wood preservatives or bright colors. The workers applied coat after coat of dark pitch and paint, until the wood swallowed the light, making the ships look like shadows gliding across the water. This was not merely for camouflage during night raids, it was a theatrical statement, a visual representation of the death that followed in her wake. The black ships were designed to look like floating hearses, spectral entities that did not belong to the world of the living. In the superstitious mind of the medieval sailor, black was the color of the plague, of witchcraft, and of the void, and Jean weaponized this fear masterfully. She wanted her enemies to feel a chill in their marrow before a single arrow was fired, to know instantly that they were not facing a conventional enemy but a force of nature. The black hulls would become legendary, rendering her fleet instantly recognizable from the coast of Normandy to the cliffs of Dover, a dark omen that signaled the end of hope for any French vessel unlucky enough to cross their path. To complete the terrifying aesthetic, Jean ordered that the sails be dyed a deep, saturated blood red. This was an arduous and expensive process, requiring vast amounts of dye to achieve the specific, visceral shade she demanded. When the sails were hoisted, they stood out against the gray skies and the blue sea like open wounds, a stark and violent contrast to the black hulls. The red sails were a declaration of her intent, they symbolized the blood of her husband, Olivier, which she believed had been spilled unjustly, and the blood of the French nobility that she intended to spill in return. The visual impact of the Black Fleet was calculated to be psychologically devastating. When these ships appeared on the horizon, the combination of the funeral black and the arterial red created an image that bypassed logic and struck directly at the primal fears of the observers. It was a livery of war never before seen in European waters, a heraldry of pure vengeance that acknowledged no king and no country. Jean had created a brand of terror, ensuring that the survivors of her attacks would carry the image of the black and red ships into every port, spreading the legend of the Lioness of Brittany far faster than any messenger could ride. The transformation of the ships mirrored the transformation of Jean herself. As the final coats of paint dried and the provisions were loaded, she shed the last vestiges of the Lady de Clisson. She donned armor, not for ceremonial purposes, but for the brutal reality of boarding actions, adapting her attire to the grim necessities of maritime warfare. The soft fabrics of the court were replaced by leather and chain mail, and her hands, once accustomed to needlework and prayer books, now learned the weight of the axe and the sword. She stood on the quarterdeck of her flagship, named My Revenge, in some accounts, as a figure carved from iron, ready to cast off the lines that bound her to the civilized world. The local populace watched the preparations with a mixture of awe and horror, whispering that the widow had made a pact with dark powers to launch such a fleet. They saw the black ships bobbing in the harbor as unnatural things, beasts waiting to be unleashed, and they were not entirely wrong. Jean had effectively died along with her husband in Paris. The woman who remained was a revenant, fueled by a grief so potent it had mutated into a cold, strategic fury. She had turned her pain into a weapon, forging a fleet that was an extension of her own shattered heart, hardened and painted in the colors of mourning and murder. By the time the fleet was ready to sail, Jean had spent every coin she possessed, gambling her entire future on the success of her crusade. She had no home to return to, no lands to provide income, and no allies to call upon should she fail. It was a burn-the-boats moment in the most literal sense. Her only home now was the wooden deck beneath her feet, and her only harvest would be the plunder taken from French merchantmen. The absolute nature of her commitment terrified her enemies because it meant she could not be reasoned with, bribed, or threatened. She had already lost everything that mattered, and a person with nothing to lose is the most dangerous adversary on earth. As the lines were cast off and the wind caught the blood-red sails, the Black Fleet moved out of the harbor, cutting through the waves like a knife. The three ships stayed in tight formation, a wolf pack on the prowl, heading towards the busy shipping lanes where the wealth of France drifted on the tides. Jean stood at the prow, her eyes fixed on the horizon, leaving the coast of Brittany behind. She was no longer a subject of the Valois king, she was a sovereign of the sea, a pirate queen who had declared a personal war on one of the most powerful nations in history. The ocean was vast and indifferent, but starting from that day, it would run red with the consequences of a king's betrayal. Thus began a 13-year reign of terror that would baffle historians and terrify sailors for generations. The Black Fleet did not merely attack, it hunted with a precision and a ferocity that suggested a guiding intelligence obsessed with suffering. The three ships, purchased with the liquidated legacy of the Clisson family, became the instruments of a divine retribution, proving that while a king could kill a man, he could not kill the rage of a woman who loved him. The transformation was complete, the widow was gone, and the lioness had taken her place, sailing under colors that promised neither quarter nor mercy to the flag of France. Thus began the reign of the Black Fleet, a maritime anomaly that would haunt the shipping lanes of the English Channel for 13 long years. It was an era that transformed the narrow strip of sea between England and France from a commercial highway into a theater of Gothic horror. The three ships, commanded by the widow who had cast aside her rosary for a boarding axe, did not operate according to the established rules of piracy or privateering. Ordinary pirates were motivated by greed, seeking cargo that could be fenced in the back alleys of port cities, and they generally avoided combat unless it was necessary to secure the prize. Jean de Clisson, however, was driven by a hunger that no amount of gold could sate. She was hunting for the very soul of the French nobility, and her currency was the terror she instilled in the hearts of the king's subjects. The waters of the Channel, usually grey and choppy, became the backdrop for a campaign of systematic violence that defied the strategic logic of the ongoing war. Merchants and supply ships flying the banner of the Lily soon learned to fear the horizon, scanning the mist for the distinctive silhouette of the black hulls. The appearance of Jean's fleet was not merely a military engagement, it was viewed by sailors as an omen of bad luck, a supernatural manifestation of a woman's grief turned toxic. The ships moved with a predatory grace, their blood-red sails catching the wind like the wings of a demon, closing the distance on their prey with a terrifying inevitability that left seasoned captains paralyzed with indecision. Jean's strategy was aggressive and reckless, born of a desire to inflict maximum damage rather than to preserve her own assets. When the Black Fleet spotted a French vessel, there were no warning shots fired across the bow, no demands for surrender, and no negotiations for safe passage. The order was always to close in for boarding, to grapple the enemy ship and flood its decks with her crew of mercenaries and cutthroats. The battles were short, brutal, and incredibly violent, as Jean's men fought with the ferocity of those who knew that the gallows awaited them if they were ever captured. They swept across the enemy decks like a tidal wave, overwhelming the French defenders through sheer savagery and the psychological weight of their dark reputation. Once the fighting ceased and the smoke cleared, the true nature of the Black Fleet's mission revealed itself, distinguishing Jean from every other sea rover of her time. In a standard maritime raid, the victorious captain would assess the value of the cargo and the ransom potential of the crew, calculating profit margins with cold pragmatism. On Jean's deck, however, a different kind of accounting took place, one that had nothing to do with livres or florins. The survivors of the French crew were herded into the center of the waist, disarmed, bleeding, and terrified, while the Lioness of Brittany prepared to pass judgment. The air would grow heavy with anticipation, the sounds of the sea drowned out by the collective holding of breath as the sorting process began. The division of the prisoners was the first step in Jean's ritual of vengeance, a subversion of the feudal social order that left the captives bewildered. In the 14th century, a noble was a valuable asset, a walking bag of gold to be treated with courtesy and exchanged for a heavy ransom, while the common sailor was often considered disposable. Jean reversed this logic entirely. She would walk among the prisoners, her eyes scanning their clothing and their hands, looking for the telltale signs of aristocracy, the fine linen, the signet rings, the soft palms that had never hauled a rope. The common sailors and low-born soldiers were often separated and pushed to the rail, their lives hanging in the balance of her whim. For the commoners, the encounter often ended with a surprising, albeit rough, dismissal. Jean viewed the peasantry and the working sailors as irrelevant to her quarrel, they were merely the tools of the king, gears in a machine they did not control. While they were sometimes killed in the heat of battle or stripped of their possessions, many were spared, tossed into longboats or left on their stripped vessels to drift back to shore. Their survival was not an act of mercy, but a calculation. They were the messengers, the voices that would carry the tale of what happened to the masters they served. Jean needed witnesses to spread the contagion of fear, to whisper in the taverns of Normandy that the widow was not at war with the people, but with the crown. The fate of the nobility, however, was the dark centerpiece of the drama. Once the knights, the wealthy merchants, and the naval officers were isolated, they were stripped of their armor and forced to their knees on the hardwood of the deck. These men, accustomed to the deference of their inferiors and the protection of the laws of chivalry, suddenly found themselves staring up at a woman who recognized neither. They would attempt to offer ransoms, shouting out the names of their estates and the depth of their coffers, promising wealth that could build cathedrals. But their pleas fell on deaf ears, for Jean de Clisson was not looking to build a fortune, she was looking to dismantle a kingdom, one severed neck at a time. It was at this moment that Jean would step forward, fully claiming her title as the Lioness. She did not delegate the grim task of execution to a subordinate, nor did she employ a hangman to do the work distantly. She carried a heavy boarding axe, a weapon of war rather than justice, its blade often already notched from the combat. The sight of a high-born lady wielding such a tool was grotesque and terrifying, a final shattering of the image of the nurturing mother she had once been. She approached the kneeling aristocrats not with the anger of a soldier, but with the cold, dead-eyed focus of a butcher engaging in their trade, viewing the men before her not as human beings, but as proxies for Philip VI. The executions were visceral and intimate, carried out with a brutality that shocked even her own hardened crew. Jean would grasp the hair of a French knight, forcing his head down onto the gunwale or a block of wood, ignoring his prayers or his screams. With a swing of the axe, she would deliver the fatal blow, often requiring more than one strike to sever the head completely. She wanted to feel the impact, to see the life leave their eyes, and to witness the physical reality of their death. It was a ritual of bloodletting that served as a temporary salve for the wound in her own soul, a frantic attempt to balance the scales that had been tipped by the murder of her husband. As the heads of the French nobility rolled across the deck, the blue blood of the aristocracy mingled with the sea spray, staining the planks of the Black Fleet in a gruesome testament to her resolve. Jean was said to watch the blood flow with a look of grim satisfaction, a moment of catharsis where the power of the French crown was reduced to red puddles at her feet. She was desecrating the very idea of nobility, proving that their titles could not save them and that their king could not protect them. Every stroke of the axe was a message sent directly to the Louvre Palace in Paris, a bloody letter written in the vernacular of violence. This specific targeting of the upper class sent shockwaves through the French naval command. The certainty of death for any captured officer made the prospect of facing the Black Fleet terrifyingly absolute. Captains began to refuse commissions to hunt her, and knights who were eager for glory on the battlefield found excuses to avoid naval transport. Jean had successfully weaponized the class structure of the Middle Ages against itself. By removing the safety net of ransom, she turned every engagement into a fight to the death, eroding the morale of the French forces before the ships even collided. The hunters became the hunted, paralyzed by the knowledge that the Lioness did not take prisoners among the peerage. Yet, in this orgy of violence, there was always one exception, a singular twist that displayed her mastery of psychological warfare. From the group of condemned nobles, Jean would often select one man, perhaps the one who looked the most terrified, or the one with the highest rank, and grant him a reprieve. This was not an act of forgiveness, it was an assignment. This survivor would be forced to watch the execution of his peers, to stand covered in their blood, trembling as the axe rose and fell. He was spared for one purpose only, to return to the court of Philip VI and describe exactly what he had seen. Jean would drag the survivor to the rail, gripping him by the tunic, and deliver her message with a voice as cold as the winter sea. She instructed him to go to the king and tell him that the Lioness of Brittany was still hungry, and that the debt for Olivier's head had not yet been paid. She wanted the king to know the details, the sounds of the dying, the color of the sails, the look in her eyes. She understood that a written letter could be burned or ignored, but a traumatized, broken nobleman, weeping before the throne, was a testament that could not be silenced. These survivors were living ghosts, haunting the French court with the presence of an enemy who could not be caught. For 13 years, this cycle repeated itself with the regularity of the tides. The seasons changed, the war on the mainland ebbed and flowed, kings aged and died, but the Black Fleet remained a constant, terrifying variable in the equation. Jean de Clisson grew older on the decks of her ships, her skin weathered by the salt and the wind, her hands calloused by the axe, but her fury did not dim. She became a mythical figure while she was still alive, a bogeyman used to frighten children in French coastal villages, the woman who had rejected her place in the natural order to become an avenging angel of the Atlantic. The sheer duration of her campaign is what cemented her legacy. Most pirate careers were short, ending in a mutiny, a storm, or a hangman's noose within a few years. Jean persisted for over a decade, outmaneuvering the French navy time and time again. She utilized her knowledge of the Breton coast, hiding in the jagged inlets and treacherous currents where the larger royal galleys dared not follow. Her fleet became a phantom, striking where the French were weakest and vanishing before a counterattack could be mounted. It was a war of attrition, and for 13 years, the widow of Clisson was winning. In the end, the Black Fleet did not just destroy ships, it destroyed the illusion of French invulnerability at sea. Jean de Clisson proved that a single motivated individual, armed with righteous anger and a total disregard for convention, could hold a monarchy hostage. The waters of the Channel, which should have been a conduit for trade and troop movements, became a graveyard for the French aristocracy. As the years ground on, the list of the dead grew longer, and the legend of the woman with the axe and the red sails became etched into the history of the 100 Years' War, a bloody footnote that no amount of royal propaganda could erase. The rumors of the Black Fleet eventually solidified into hard, undeniable reports that penetrated the thick stone walls of the Louvre Palace, reaching the ears of King Philip VI. At first, the monarch had dismissed the tales of a pirate widow as the fantastical exaggerations of superstitious sailors, the kind of folklore that naturally arises from the chaos of war. He believed that the ocean was simply claiming ships due to storms or English privateers, and that the Lioness was a convenient scapegoat for the incompetence of his own admirals. However, as the months turned into years and the manifests of lost cargo piled up alongside the lists of missing noblemen, the king was forced to confront the reality that he had created a monster. The reports were too consistent, the descriptions of the black hulls and red sails too specific, and the locations of the attacks too daring to be ignored. The execution of Olivier de Clisson, intended to demonstrate the absolute power of the French crown, had instead birthed an adversary who mocked that power with every tide. Philip VI, a ruler already burdened by the escalating conflict with England and the financial strains of his kingdom, reacted with the fury of a man whose authority was being publicly dismantled. He commanded the French navy, reinforced by hired Genoese galleys, to sweep the English Channel and the Bay of Biscay to hunt down this insolent woman. The orders were explicit: there was to be no trial, no imprisonment, and no quarter given. Jean de Clisson was to be sunk or captured and immediately executed as a traitor and a pirate. The might of one of Europe's strongest nations was mobilized to crush 3 wooden ships, a disparity of force that should have resulted in a swift victory for the crown. Admirals studied the charts, captains doubled their watches, and spies were dispatched to the coastal towns of Brittany to sniff out her anchorage, all confident that the Amazon of the sea would soon be nothing more than a footnote in the royal archives. Yet, the hunt for the Black Fleet proved to be an exercise in maddening futility, revealing the cumbersome nature of the Royal Navy when pitted against a guerrilla force. The French warships were heavy, designed for pitched battles and the transport of troops, struggling to maneuver in the treacherous shallows and jagged coastlines where Jean felt most at home. She knew the tides of Brittany better than she knew the lines of her own palm, using the fog banks and the rocky inlets to vanish whenever the royal sails appeared on the horizon. Her ships were lighter, faster, and crewed by men who navigated by instinct and desperation, allowing them to dance around the clumsy giants sent to destroy them. To the French captains, she seemed to possess a supernatural awareness, striking a convoy off Normandy one day and disappearing, only to reappear a week later off the coast of Poitou, leaving them chasing ghosts in the mist. When naval force failed, the king turned to the darker instruments of statecraft, authorizing the use of assassins and bounty hunters to end the threat. Large sums of gold were promised to anyone who could bring her head to Paris, a temptation that attracted the dregs of the underworld from every port in Europe. Agents disguised as merchants or defectors attempted to infiltrate her crew, and knives waited in the shadows of the few English harbors where she docked to resupply. But Jean was protected by a wall of loyalty forged in blood and gold. Her crew knew that their lives depended entirely on her survival, and they guarded her with the ferocity of a Praetorian guard. Every attempt on her life was met with swift, brutal justice, and the bodies of would-be assassins were often found floating in the harbor waters, serving as a grim deterrent to anyone else tempted by the king's coin. Realizing that she could not be easily caught or killed, Jean de Clisson escalated her campaign, refining her vengeance into a precise instrument of psychological warfare designed to rot the French court from within. She understood that sinking ships was merely an economic annoyance to a king, but terror was a poison that could paralyze a government. She ceased to be merely a pirate and became a playwright of horror, orchestrating her attacks to ensure that the narrative of her fury reached the one audience that mattered. The destruction of a ship was no longer the end goal, it was the stage for a message that had to be delivered personally to Philip VI. To achieve this, she instituted a policy that was both merciful and incredibly cruel, the sparing of a single witness. The selection of this messenger was a macabre ritual that took place on the blood-slicked decks of her flagship after the slaughter had ended. While the rest of the noble prisoners were being lined up for the axe, Jean would walk among them, searching for a man of sufficient rank and fragility to carry her burden. She looked for an officer or a lord whose eyes betrayed a breaking point, someone who would not just recount the facts, but who would convey the emotional texture of the horror. When she found her chosen vessel, she would pull him from the line of the condemned, forcing him to stand beside her as she went about her grisly work. He was not spared to look away, he was commanded to watch, to absorb every scream and every spray of blood, so that he could become a living archive of the massacre. This survivor was then given a small boat or put ashore at the nearest French outpost, stripped of his weapons and dignity, but burdened with a command that weighed heavier than chains. Jean's instructions were always the same: he was to ride day and night to Paris, gain an audience with the king, and tell him exactly what he had seen. She did not send written ultimatums or demands for the return of her lands, for she knew that paper could be burned and ignored by secretaries. A living, breathing French nobleman, traumatized and weeping, could not be filed away. He was a contagion of fear, released to infect the safety of the royal court with the reality of the violence that lurked at sea. The arrival of these messengers at the Louvre became a recurring nightmare for the court, a spectacle that silenced the music and the laughter of the courtiers. These men, often originating from proud families, would stand before the throne in borrowed clothes, shaking with the aftershocks of their ordeal, their eyes haunted by the memories of the axe. They would recount the attack, the overwhelming speed of the black ships, and the merciless efficiency of the crew, but the king always pressed them for the details of the woman herself. He needed to know if she was mad, if she was breaking, if there was any sign of hesitation that could be exploited. Instead, the witnesses brought him only descriptions of a woman made of ice and iron, a figure who killed without passion but with a terrifying dedication. The most chilling part of the testimony, repeated by survivor after survivor, was the description of Jean's demeanor during the executions. They told the king that she did not scream in anger or weep for her lost husband while she swung the axe. Instead, she laughed. It was described not as the laughter of joy, but as the cold, hollow sound of a soul that had severed its ties with humanity, a sound that cut sharper than the blade. She wanted the king to know that she was enjoying the dismantling of his chivalry, that she found a dark satisfaction in spilling the blue blood that Philip held so dear. This image of the laughing widow, drenched in gore under the red sails, was crafted specifically to haunt the king's sleep, to show him that his cruelty had not chastened her, but had liberated her from all moral constraints. Through these messengers, Jean made it explicitly clear that her war was not against the abstract concept of France, nor was it a proxy war for the English King Edward. She instructed the survivors to tell Philip that this was a personal vendetta, a duel between the House of Clisson and the House of Valois. She wanted him to understand that every ship sunk and every noble beheaded was a direct response to the treachery of the tournament in Paris. By framing the conflict as a blood feud, she stripped the king of his political defenses. He could not claim to be fighting for the safety of the realm when the enemy was solely focused on punishing him for his own sins. She was declaring that the war would only end when one of them was in the grave, creating a binary destiny that allowed for no treaties and no truces. The psychological impact on King Philip VI was profound and visible to those closest to him. The monarch, already struggling with failing health and the pressures of the English invasion, began to see the shadow of Jean de Clisson in every corner of his palace. The impotence of his navy and his assassins gnawed at his prestige, making him look weak in the eyes of his own court. He had killed Olivier de Clisson to secure his power, but in doing so, he had unleashed a force that made him powerless. The knowledge that a woman was out there, unreachable and unstoppable, systematically murdering his friends and lieutenants, created an atmosphere of paranoia that permeated the government. Every time a messenger arrived from the coast, the court held its breath, wondering which family would be wearing mourning clothes by evening. The legend of the lioness grew beyond the reality of her actions, becoming a dark myth that sapped the morale of the French nation. Sailors in the royal fleet began to desert rather than face the possibility of encountering the Black Fleet, muttering that the woman was a demon sent by God to punish the king's treachery. The very color black became a symbol of bad omens in the port cities, and the sight of red sails was enough to send coastal villages into a panic. Jean had achieved what no English army could. She had instilled a deep, primal fear in the heart of the enemy, making the ocean feel like a hostile, forbidden territory where the king's writ did not run. Ultimately, the survivors were the most effective weapon in Jean's arsenal. They were the carriers of her legacy, ensuring that the king could never forget the face of the men he had murdered, because he saw it reflected in the vengeance of the wife who survived. Each account of a beheading was a fresh cut on the king's conscience, a reminder that his actions had consequences that could not be buried in a crypt. Jean de Clisson had turned the table on the monarchy. They had tried to make an example of her husband to terrify the people, but she was now making examples of his subjects to terrify the king. The vendetta had become a living thing, a monster that fed on the best of French nobility and grew stronger with every year that Philip remained on the throne. The conclusion of this sanguinary odyssey stands as a stark, historical mockery of the very concept of divine retribution and the moral certainty of poetic justice. In the medieval worldview, where every sin was expected to carry a heavy price and where those who lived by the sword were destined to die by it, the fate of Jean de Clisson was an anomaly that baffled the theologians and enraged the moralists. The common people and the nobility alike had written the ending of her story in their minds long before it happened. They envisioned a finale drenched in the same violence she had dispensed for 13 years. They predicted that the Lioness of Brittany would inevitably be swallowed by the cold grey waves of the Channel during a tempest, dragged down to hell by the weight of the souls she had sent there, or that she would be captured by a French armada and paraded in chains to Paris to face the executioner's fire. However, the universe, in its cold indifference, refused to follow the script of a morality play, denying her enemies the satisfaction of a tragic denouement. The Black Fleet, which had been the scourge of the Valois dynasty for over a decade, did not end in a glorious, fiery cataclysm of timber and sail, but rather dissolved quietly into the mists of history. After 13 years of relentless hunting, of boarding actions and decapitations, the fire that fueled Jean's vendetta began to dim, not because she was defeated, but because she was simply finished. She had spilled enough blue blood to fill a lake, she had terrified a king until he saw ghosts in the shadows, and she had proven that the will of a single woman could withstand the might of an empire. The lioness had not been tamed, she had simply become satiated, her appetite for vengeance finally curbed by the sheer scale of the suffering she had inflicted. The transition from the blood-soaked deck of a pirate flagship to the velvet-draped halls of aristocracy began with a calculated political maneuver that secured her future. Instead of waiting to be cornered by the inevitable law of averages that claims all sea rovers eventually, Jean sought the protection of the one man who had benefited most from her private war, King Edward III of England. To the French, she was a demon and a criminal, but to the English crown, she was a valuable asset and a hero who had destabilized their enemies' maritime supply lines. In the year 1356, she was welcomed not as a fugitive, but as a distinguished ally, her crimes against France washed away by the strategic gratitude of the Plantagenet court. This shift in status was cemented by a marriage that served as the final insult to the memory of Philip VI. Jean did not retire into a penitent solitude. She accepted the proposal of Sir Walter Bentley, a courageous and capable English lieutenant who served as the king's lieutenant in Brittany. This union was a masterstroke of rehabilitation, transforming the pirate queen back into a legitimate noblewoman, protected by the full military and diplomatic weight of England. The wedding was not a clandestine affair hidden in the shadows, but a public declaration that she had survived the storm. She exchanged her boarding axe for the signet ring of a wife, and the black armor for the fine silks of a lady, stepping seamlessly back into the world of privilege she had once sold to buy her ships. The couple settled in the castle of Hennebont, a formidable fortress on the Breton coast that had been a focal point of the war, now serving as the luxurious retirement home for the most dangerous woman in Europe. The image of Jeanne de Clisson walking the ramparts of Hennebont, looking out over the sea she once terrorized, offered a jarring contrast to the legend of the lioness. The locals who saw her in these later years described a woman of commanding presence, yet one who seemed entirely at peace, untroubled by the ghosts of the headless knights she had left in her wake. There was no madness in her eyes, no trembling in her hands, only the calm assurance of a victor who has claimed the spoils of war and lived to enjoy them. Her life in Hennebont was characterized by a return to the domestic stability that had been stolen from her at the beginning of the saga. She was surrounded by wealth, much of it likely derived from the plunder of French merchant vessels, now converted into tapestries, plate, and comforts for a new household. The irony was palpable: the gold taken from the French crown was now funding the peaceful old age of its greatest enemy. She was reunited with her surviving children, and her new marriage to Bentley appears to have been one of genuine affection and mutual respect. The monster of the Channel became a chatelaine, managing estates and hosting banquets, while the families of her victims in France continued to mourn in empty halls. The French court, now under the rule of John II following the death of Philip, could only watch in impotent fury as their nemesis lived out her days in comfort just across the border of their influence. The bounties on her head remained uncollected, the assassins returned empty-handed or not at all, and the legal decrees condemning her to death gathered dust in the archives of Paris. Jeanne had achieved the impossible: she had beaten the system. She had violated every law of God and man, committed acts of unspeakable cruelty, and yet she was not being punished. She was being rewarded with a happily ever after that was usually reserved for the virtuous heroines of courtly romances, proving that in the real Game of Thrones, ruthlessness is often the surest path to survival. As the years passed, the legend of the Black Fleet began to drift into folklore, but the woman herself remained vividly, stubbornly alive. She did not succumb to the madness that often claims those who have seen too much death, nor did she seek absolution from the church for her violent past. There is no record of Jeanne de Clisson founding chantries to pray for the souls of the men she beheaded, nor of her engaging in great acts of public penance. She seemed to view her actions not as sins requiring forgiveness, but as a necessary balancing of the scales, a debt collection that had been fully settled. Her conscience, it appeared, was as clear as the sky over Brittany, unburdened by the weight of the axe. The end came not with a bang, but with a whisper, in the year 1359. Jeanne de Clisson, the scourge of the French navy, the woman who had painted the sea red, died in her own bed, tucked under warm linens, surrounded by her family and her servants. The cause of death was not a sword wound or a poisoned chalice, but the mundane frailty of the human body giving way to time. The scene of her passing was tranquil, disturbing in its normalcy. The hands that had swung the axe and steered the black ships now held the hands of her loved ones, receiving the last rites of the church she had likely ignored for so long. Her death sent a ripple of disbelief through the courts of Europe. It seemed fundamentally wrong, a glitch in the moral fabric of the universe, that such a life should end so peacefully. The chroniclers of the time struggled to reconcile her violent deeds with her serene departure, forced to record the uncomfortable truth that the wicked do not always suffer. The French historians vilified her as a she-wolf who escaped justice, while the Breton and English accounts painted her as a tragic heroine who found peace after a lifetime of struggle. But regardless of the narrative, the physical reality remained: she had outlived her enemies, she had kept her freedom, and she had died on her own terms. The funeral of Jeanne de Clisson was a solemn affair, attended by the nobility of Brittany and English officers, who paid their respects to the Lady of Clisson and Belleville. She was buried with the honors befitting a woman of high station, her grave serving as the final punctuation mark to a sentence written in blood. The location of her final resting place became a subject of local legend, a spot where the wind from the sea reportedly blew colder than anywhere else. Even in death, she commanded a mixture of fear and respect, a lingering presence that refused to be forgotten by the land that had birthed her. Her legacy, however, was far more enduring than her tomb. Jeanne de Clisson left history in a state of profound bewilderment, posing a difficult question about the nature of justice. Her story forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the arc of the moral universe does not always bend toward justice, or at least not in the way we expect. Sometimes, the monster survives the story. Sometimes, the person who burns down the world gets to warm their hands by the fire and die of old age in a soft bed. It is a finale that provokes outrage and fear because it suggests that the universe is chaotic and unfair, and that power and will are the only true arbitrators of fate. In the centuries that followed, the tale of the Black Fleet became a favorite of storytellers and romanticists, who often embellished the details but could never change the ending. The image of the red sails and the black hull became a symbol of resistance and the terrifying power of a woman's grief. Yet, the most shocking part of the story remains the silence of the final chapter. No thunderbolt struck the castle of Hennebont, no demons came to drag her soul away in front of witnesses. There was only the quiet closing of a door, the extinguishing of a candle, and the final breath of a woman who had dared to declare war on a king and had won. Ultimately, the story of Jean de Clisson is not a tragedy, nor is it a comedy, it is a brutal testament to the complexity of the human condition. It is the story of how love can curdle into hate, how a victim can become a butcher, and how the boundaries between heroism and villainy are often drawn by the victor. She left the world not with a scream, but with the silence of a calm sea, leaving us to wonder if she found peace in the void, or if she simply carried her war into the afterlife, ready to hunt the soul of Philip VI through the eternities. But here, in the mortal realm, the lioness slept, proving once and for all that in the dark waters of history, sometimes the predators are the only ones who make it to shore.